This is an Irreverent podcast. Check out irreverent.fm for shows from all our friends.
The Ozarks, it's more than a place, it's a feeling. Here at Silver Dollar City, it's the feeling we get from creating, discovering, and putting on a show. It's that powerful spark we get from exploring something old and experiencing something new. Plan your visit to America's #1 theme park today. Silver Dollar City, the heart of the Ozarks.
Yes! Yes! A Lego set is a gift that always clicks. And clicks. Ooh, ooh, and clicks. For kids who love to save the day, choose a Lego set. A gift that always clicks.
My guest today is Amar Peterman. Amar is an Indian-American scholar working at the intersection of faith and public life and author of the new book, Becoming Neighbors, The Common Good Made Local. Amar, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be with you.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk about your book. We have a mutual friend or acquaintance that connected us years ago, and I just texted her the other day. It's like, well, I'm finally talking to Amar. So I'm excited to talk about your book. I think it's a very interesting entry into this space about local-oriented things. But I usually like to start before, even with authors, in talking about books, I do like to start just by talking about your own sort of experience within church and starting at the start. So where did you grow up, and what was the sort of religious environment of your upbringing like?
Yeah, so I was born in northern India and adopted and brought to northeast Wisconsin as an infant. And I grew up in a small town outside Green Bay, Wisconsin called Pulaski, which you might tell from the name is a Polish Catholic neighborhood. And grew up there playing in polka bands and celebrating Fat Tuesday and all the adornments of a Catholic neighborhood. But I worshipped in the town over at a white evangelical megachurch. And that's where my family was deeply involved. My dad was on staff and then as an elder there. And so I navigated from the beginning kind of this tension of, there's a lot coming out right now, especially with J.D. Vance, about this kind of anti-Catholicism within American evangelicalism and how Vance is reconciling that. And that reminded me much of how I grew up, where my evangelical, youth group friends would be like, oh, the Catholics are, really suspicious. You got to be careful around them. Then I go to school, and all my friends were Catholic and going through confirmation, and they thought I was wacky because I was going to youth group, and I didn't have to go through a confirmation or some sort of catechesis, where, I was in high school, ended up being a worship leader on staff at this mega church. And it was all I knew as how Christianity was supposed to be practiced. And so I assumed this is the best way. This is what you do. You put together the set list, you have kind of the TED Talky sermons. And I was like, I had the evangelical fervor. Like I was devoted. I was front row of the in the sanctuary on early service and late service, and restocking the coffee in between, taking notes and retaking notes. It had just this deep passion in this evangelical space. And yet, it was a white evangelical space. And for as much as they would give me a microphone to sing lyrics that were, pre-written, when it came to offering a space to speak about my own experience, to ask questions, especially around race and ethnicity, around the way that Christians have acted throughout American history, but also in my own neighborhood, and why the people at my church were so scared to go to the east side of town, where it was a predominantly Black and Hispanic population. When I asked those questions, I was immediately shut down, and there was seemingly no answer to these questions of dissonance and tension that I felt as a brown body in these white spaces. But again, it was all I knew, and so I tried to navigate that space the best that I could. And so my religious upbringing was deeply evangelical, And I held on to that for much of my life and into Bible college and even the beginning of seminary.
Hmm. And you went to Moody, so I mean that sounds, from everyone that I've spoken to that's attended, I mean, it sounds certainly intense or formative, regardless of whether that's you consider that good or bad in retrospect. So what was an environment like Moody like for you, um having come from rural Wisconsin?
Yeah, I mean, I I went to Moody out of ignorance, which is to say that I just didn't know any better. None of my family is theologically educated. Some of the pastors at my church had gone to Moody. Very few graduated from Moody, but they had spent time there. And so when it came to look for schools after high school or in the end of high school, I just Googled Bible college. And
Hmm.
Wheaton came up and Biola and some of these other schools. I'm like, I can't afford to go there. Like, what is this? And then there was Moody, downtown Chicago, right on the corner of Chicago and LaSalle, tuition paid program.
Hmm.
Um, and it was like, this is the place to go. This is the place that I'm supposed to be. Um, I did give God something of like a alternative. I was also very big into jazz music, and I was
Oh.
either gonna go to a local state school and study jazz history and then performance, or I was gonna go into the ministry and be a, you know, uh, but when I applied to Moody, I picked theology because it sounded like philosophy, and I knew philosophers were smart, and so maybe people who study theology would also be presumably smart.
Hmm.
That's just like the little amount that I knew of this whole world. Uh, and so I ended up at Moody and quickly realized, similar to the church that I grew up in, that there was not a place for me there unless I was willing to conform or subsume or assimilate myself into the vision of Christianity that they held not only as the best, but the only. It was an exclusive vision of a deeply white practice of Christian faith that's rooted in a deeply white history that goes
Hmm.
from, Moody Bible Institute today, back to Billy Graham, to D.L. Moody, to Whitfield and Edwards, to the Reformers, and they didn't talk much beyond that. Uh,
Right.
but I grew up in the space and was theologically trained in this space, and had professors tell me, when I would ask these questions around similar to growing up, race and ethnicity, downtown Chicago as Black Lives Matter protests are happening, and America's kind of on the brink of this racial reckoning that really came into full form through the pandemic. Um, and professors said essentially, you either have to be a Christian or an Indian. You leave your Indian identity behind and find your identity in Christ, or you leave your identity in Christ and embrace this pagan Indianness that you think, that you claim is yours
Wow.
or claim as your heritage. And so it truly was like subsuming, assimilating into the ideal, like white, self sufficient man that they were trying to create out of theologians and Bible students. It wasn't until I met Ashish Varma, who the book is dedicated to, who at the time was a professor at Moody. He's not there anymore, but lives out in the Wheaton suburbs, uh, and grew up in Wheaton in the 90s, rooting for Michael Jordan and the Bulls and listening to Norah Jones. And he was certainly an anomaly at Moody, and was very aloof and would hide in his office and study literally by a lamplight. Like he wouldn't turn his main light on in his
Hmm.
office. And one day I just knocked on his door and asked him, I don't know what to do here. Ashish is a Indian American as well, and I said, can you help me? He said, I don't know if I can help you, but we can talk. And he became a lifeline and a support and a mentor and then a friend in this space, who showed me that what I was told, that Indianness and Christianity don't go together, was absolutely wrong. Um, and he said that explicitly in the way that he would talk about how his Indianness made him a better Christian and his Christian faith made him a better Indian. But more importantly than that, he lived out that example. And in the books that he would sneak into my backpack that would never make it onto a Moody syllabi, uh, the conversations we would have, the way that we do independent studies, he opened up a world of theology that is broadly like global theology. It's what the majority of the world is doing. But also put me in, relationship with fellow students asking these questions as well. And we read liberation theologies and post-colonial theologies, and scholars outside the Christian tradition together. And that was deeply formative. And he was the one who encouraged me to apply to Princeton Seminary to study. When I was after coming to Moody, was very skeptical of continuing theological education.
Hmm.
I wanted to go to a school where I could study history or study something with people who weren't religious or who were, but the focus was the study, not the faith. Uh, and he said, no, you should check out seminary. Like, I think you would thrive there. I think this is a place where you can embrace an identity as a theologian. And so it's through his encouragement that I ended out east, a Presbyterian seminary, as someone who grew up in a white evangelical church and then went to Moody. And I learned what the main line was. I also met wonderful people who
Yeah.
supported me along that journey as well.
Yeah. Yeah. It does seem like over the years of having conversations like this, it does seem that Princeton and Duke are two of these sort of not necessarily off ramps, but additional waypoints for people who, as you've said, whether it was a combination of like theological and racial things, and that's not to say that those things are even distinct. Like those are enmeshed sort of questions. That those are places where if you reach the limits of what's accepted within evangelical orthodoxy, then those are places in which you can continue to grow. So
Mhm.
so what was that additional experience at a place like Princeton? Did you start to feel like you had more opportunity to be your fuller self in a environment like that, or were there similar tensions even in a place like Princeton?
Yeah, I mean, initially it was really confusing. I went out to Princeton because I was dissatisfied with the theological frameworks Moody had given me around, especially at the time I was thinking about the role of women in ministry, of queer people, and the LGBTQ plus community broadly in the church. And Moody obviously had their answers. I did not like their answers. I didn't think they were well thought. I didn't think they were well reasoned. But similarly to growing up, like I didn't have an alternative.
Hmm.
And I knew I could have gone to a seminary where someone would have given a 15-minute spiel about how they think that queer people can be pastors and here's why they're wrong. And then we're going to have the rest of this semester assuming that we all agree.
Hmm.
And I said, no, I want to go to a place where queer people, non-binary people are teaching theology, where professors deny the resurrection and say, I'm a Christian, and I teach theology in this format. I want to engage with people who staked their lives on these claims, lived out of these claims, and yet were Christians. And to say, this is, if I'm going to disagree, it has to be at this point. It can't be at these kind of straw man arguments. I came in thinking I was going to have this like really reasoned theological, analysis in my mind. And then I met students and professors who lived out the Christian faith in the most beautiful, wonderful, and compelling ways that the question became obsolete. And like, how could I ever have thought that women couldn't be ministers? Like, these women are ministering in ways far better than I've ever seen someone minister before, and the passion and the desire they have to care for congregations and people is the most Christ-like thing that I've seen or witnessed in much of my life. I still held on to, I went to seminary in part to try and figure out my place within American evangelicalism while
Hmm.
taking a step outside of it,
Hmm.
rather than going to an evangelical seminary, going to a mainline seminary. And I ended up being drawn to American religious history, and I studied with Heath Carter, who arrived at Princeton Seminary the same year that I came in, and was a scholar and historian of American Christianity, and I took a class with him on social Christianity and American inequality. The first person we studied was D.L. Moody, and I was hooked, intrigued, learned
Hmm.
about revivals, learned about Ida B. Wells attending one of Moody's revivals and going, what is going on here? And getting deep into the archives. And it was wonderful. It was uh, illuminating. And it became a path for me to question, is there a place for me in the evangelical tradition by way of historical precedent? Are there people who took on the theological commitments of American evangelicalism uh, and used them to different ends than their white counterparts? And that ended up becoming my master's thesis. Um, and at the time of writing, I ended with a more hopeful conclusion of saying, yes, I think you can belong to the evangelical tradition um, by holding on to the theological commitments. This was during COVID, during this, racial reckoning that we were talking about. This is when, uh, right before Jesus and John Wayne came out, I was chatting with Kristen Dumais because she knows Heath and he connected the two of us.
Hmm.
Um, and she was incredibly gracious and also was like, you should read my book when it comes out.
Yeah.
And that became, uh, a really helpful resource, and
Hmm.
obviously caught the cultural zeitgeist at a perfect time.
Yeah.
Um, and so now I would say I'm less hopeful than I was when I wrote the thesis about the future of American evangelicalism and holding on to a reasoned commitment that theology is driving the bus rather than identity, politics, cultural, in group thinking, and all of that. Uh, and so but Princeton became the place to explore those things with a space that wasn't inherently uh, complementary uh, or championing evangelicalism, but had an
Hmm.
openness to say, you academically explore that conversation here. Um,
Right.
and so that's what I did. And it became really a really fruitful and beneficial study to go through.
For sure. Yeah, yeah, and that's sort of. I mean, I hear echoes of similar concerns that I had at different points in my life too, as well, and like, um, and it is interesting just uh, the way in which like major parts of evangelical history are selectively forgotten. Like even books like I don't know if did you ever have to read Discovering an Evangelical Heritage and from Donald
No.
Dayton? So this was a famous book from the 70s. Donald Dayton, who went to I think Houghton College. I mean he grew up or his youth was during the 60s, and well, I mean the countercultural revolution, the civil rights movement, all of these things were happening, and evangelicals were on the conservative side or on the side of Jim Crow and all of these things, and he was having trouble reconciling that with his faith. And then he studied American religious history and found figures like Jonathan Blanchard and others whom there is a more progressive strain of evangelical practice and thought that is not encouraged in
Mhm.
spaces like Moody or other places. And so I mean uh, that's fascinating to hear. That it's something that young evangelicals every generation
Yeah.
struggle with,
Yeah.
and like come back to. And yeah, that's to me that's just fascinating that was also part of what you saw as necessary to explore for yourself and for trying to determine your place and within this movement, or whether that is something. um I don't know how to summarize that neatly, just whether that was something a path you wanted to continue on.
Yeah. Yeah, and now I'm continuing that through. I'm in a PhD program now at U Chicago, and again, I feel like I learn the best when I'm swimming against the current,
Hmm.
and so I went to a mainline seminary as something of an evangelical, and now I'm in and around the tradition, but not. I wouldn't lead with saying I am an evangelical, but I would say that I think you can make a strong case for as you were just mentioned, evangelical theology, core doctrine being used to radically different ends than
Hmm.
its white counterparts. And you see this in strains of progressivism within the tradition that get opened up and then shut down. And then from, my limited knowledge of the history, usually those folks just don't stick around. They find a different tradition that's more eager to embrace them. And now, I mean, my studies, the other half of the history was a school of philosophy called pragmatism that was started with kind of these Anglo-American philosophers like William James,
Hmm.
John Dewey, into James or John McDowell, and then now Richard Rorty, Robert Brandom. Deeply postmodern in a sense, deeply relativistic, challenging the assumptions of normative language and meaning making. And that's become a platform or a kind of a launching point to ask the question of how does this relate to doctrine? Does doctrine or doctrinal belief have some objective set metaphysical thing, or is doctrine always materialized in particular places and contexts and then used in radically different ways? And what, if that's true, then what do we do with that? And what do we do when traditions are claiming the same doctrine, the same beliefs, and using them against one another? One person says Jesus is Lord means we, serve the poor and those in need. We seek liberation for the oppressed and the marginalized. And another says, oh, we take up arms and we go fight, the Muslims overseas.
Mm.
And both are claiming the same theological doctrine. They're claiming the same Jesus, or the same idea of who they think Jesus is,
Right.
but using that Jesus to radically different ends. And so that's what my research in my PhD program is now, but doing that alongside people who are not only skeptical of evangelicalism, they're skeptical of Christianity and the role of a theologian in the academy as worthy of being there. And so once again, like I'm finding myself pushing against colleagues and peers, professors, to try and make a strong case for a strong theologically rooted case for the nature and role of doctrine in American life. And so, yeah, the academy's always been a fun place to try and sort these questions out. It's also been something of, I'd say, almost protected space. Like there's a freedom in the academy of asking questions. UChicago's very much forwards this idea of free inquiry, that believe what you want to believe, but be able to defend it.
Right.
And so that's been my attempt in this program, is to believe what I believe and make a strong case for it. Not in I suppose, I'm hearing the evangelical, like apologetic tone in me of like have a reason, for the hope
Yeah.
that you have in Christ. But no, have a philosophic, have a reason for your belief that can be defended in the academy, not just the church, not just the shopping mall, but with other academics who have very well reasoned positions for not believing in Christianity, for finding religion to be deeply oppressive, regressive, in American life and the world more broadly. So yeah, this is the place that I'm in now, and trying to navigate that while also having a book out that's deeply intentionally hopeful about the Christian faith.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and we'll return to some of those elements of of people that are questioning and how a book like yours fits into that. We'll return to a couple of those themes. Before we dive sort of more into your book, one of the parts of your story that you share in the book is about getting involved in interfaith spaces. So I'd love to hear a little bit about how that also impacted how you just move in these spaces and in other parts of your life after coming from your initial environment in Wisconsin, major Catholic and evangelical influences, but now you're in more of a multi-faith, no faith type environments, just within broader American culture. But it seems from how you've written about it that those experiences were illuminating and edifying in a different sort of way. So I'd love to hear a little bit about that.
Yeah, when I got to Chicago, one thing that I had to reckon with was that the South Asians that I met, on Devon Ave and at, UIC's Muslim Student Association and this and that, uh, were people who I related to deeply and felt like they understood me as South Asians. And yet we didn't share a faith commitment. And then I would go to a deeply white space like Moody, where my supposedly most central identity, my faith, was shared, but I felt so isolated and misunderstood by the majority of people there. And to figure out what to do with this, that the people that look and sound like me don't share my faith, and the people that do seemingly want me to be something entirely different than what I am. Um, I didn't necessarily see those as like interfaith spaces at first. They were mostly coded as like I wanted to find other South Asians.
Hmm.
And then and really like I feel like I keep stumbling into interfaith work, which I think is a product of the world that we live in that's deeply religiously plural. That we will all eventually stumble into some sort of interfaith context because people of many faiths and no faith at all are all around us. They're in our neighborhoods. They're the ones we share a community with. Uh, and so it shouldn't be a question of like, oh well, when you meet someone who believes something different than you, it's like, or it shouldn't be if you do. It's when you do. You will meet people who believe fundamentally different things about the world than you. And the question for Christians, I think, is like, what will you do? How will you respond to that? Um, I ended up, I just talk about in the book, I got a scholarship to attend at the time it was called the Interfaith Leadership Institute, but the Interfaith Youth Corps hosted. Now it's the Interfaith Leadership Summit and it's Interfaith America. But I met through some very distant connections these folks who led an organization called Neighborly Faith. I did a podcast with them about ecumenism because I'd just come back from a study abroad trip across Europe and was infatuated by these beautiful cathedrals that are not typical to American evangelicalism,
Hmm.
and wanted to know more and wanted to, had these resonances with, this tie between evangelicalism and Catholicism. And now I was in like, the home of this deep Catholicism in Rome and traveling Italy and then into Germany, Switzerland, Czech Republic. And when I came back, this interfaith org could only get funding to do an ecumenical project. And so they found me, did a little interview with them. And then they said, there's this conference coming up in the summer. We have a scholarship. We'd love to give it to you to go. And I was like, I had not done interfaith work. I told some people about it at Moody and they were appalled. And I had professors who I hadn't talked to in years, who were like, oh, let's get coffee. And by the way, here's a book about how to evangelize to Muslims. And don't
Oh
forget
gosh.
the backbone that Moody gave you. And you're going to go be a light in the darkness. So wave your Christian flag and be ready to convert people and share the gospel. And I knew that wasn't right. But again, it was, kind of, I suppose, epistemic injustice of sorts was that I didn't have a different paradigm to work within. And so I showed up as best I could with an open hand and saying, I may very well, get ideologically, metaphorically punched in the face here for showing up to this thing, or it could be different. And immediately what I found was some of the most wonderful, hospitable, kind folks who greeted me, who showed me where I needed to go. And then I sat at these tables with a bunch of fellow undergrad students from across the country of many different faith traditions. And they weren't fighting or debating about their different beliefs. They were asking questions that I think they were perhaps too afraid to ask, or there was never seemingly an appropriate time to ask, what does halal mean? Is that like kosher? And what do you think about this? And, oh, do you have Mary in your holy text? Or who is Moses to you? Who are the prophets? What is Muhammad doing, in Medina? What is Medina? Where is that? And all of these questions. And I got to sit down and participate in that. And that was my introduction, I suppose, to like a formal interfaith context and meeting folks across lines of religious difference and seeing the constructive possibilities that took place there, that could happen there, that I was told were impossible, that this is only, either a betrayal of your faith or it's only going to lead to hostility, or some sort of corruption of my own faith. were completely untrue, and that there was generative, wonderful work to be done across lines of difference. And so I continued to stumble into the work. I talk in a later part of the book about working with Amar D, who's a Muslim attorney and now a professor who was working on a book on evangelicals and Muslims around in this intersection of vulnerability and a sense of vulnerability in an increasingly religiously plural America, questions of religious freedom, and things like this. And we worked together, and that was a wonderful experience. And then eventually, when I graduated from seminary, I was looking for a job, and Interfaith America reached out, and I ended up doing some consulting work with them, and then that turned into a full-time gig, and now I'm coming up on 4 years of being at Interfaith America, and finding the work of interfaith cooperation, civic pluralism as fundamental to the path forward that actually seeks the shared flourishing of all people in a community. And so now I suppose I don't often think of it as interfaith work. It's just the work to be done. But it is deeply interfaith.
Mm-hmm.
I found that in some of the earlier explicitly Christian podcasts when I began, talking about the book, and they were like, "What is interfaith?" Like, I didn't, even through writing the book, I was like, I suppose I didn't think of this as like an interfaith book or a pitch or a proposal for interfaith cooperation. But again, I think it's just something that's been so deeply embedded in me that it's just now the way that I think about the world. I think about a common good. I think about democracy and society and neighborhoods and communities and potlucks and how we join together, recognizing a reality of deep difference, irreconcilable difference. And what do we do with that? Do we throw up our hands and go, "Oh, I guess we're gonna hate each other. Guess we can't get along," or do we find something better for all of us? And so, yeah, interfaith work I've stumbled into has stuck with me, and has, for better or for worse, has become an integral part of how I see the world around us.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, because I do think, and to sort of go behind the curtain and why like that question is interesting to me is I spent the last few years, my full-time work was actually for a progressive Christian denomination in their political advocacy office. And they do a lot of work with other faith-based nonprofits that were based out of DC. But the interesting thing is that there's a National Association of Evangelicals, and they sort of are over here. And then there's a lot of interfaith stuff and ecumenical work that happens that they just sort of stay on their own and don't really participate, because for a number of reasons that we've already sort of touched on, and other ones that we'll leave unsaid. But that's, to me, that's really fascinating, and also just the way in which you had that experience, and then you also realize the way in which other evangelicals are more insulated and only really speak to one another, which I think is part of a lot of the tension that comes with engaging in with evangelical spaces or thinking, even to this day, even after things like the deconstruction space and everything has really found a foothold online over the last decade or so. So thank you for answering that question. I think it's just really fascinating. I do want to turn to the book now, Becoming Neighbors, and I will say, like, I'm very intrigued just by the overall thrust of the book, because it is based on that sort of that primarily local lens, and the way in which after the 2024 election, I mean, there was just a lot of hope lost about how people can really impact things at those national, global levels. But we all live locally, and just because we all have bodies, we're not all brains in jars yet.
Yeah.
Yeah. We're not networked and all that sort of stuff where we're multiple places at once. We still live in our houses and in our communities. Um, what drew you to that in particular, and really focusing on the local aspect of things? And let's start with the table, because it's a really powerful symbol for where your book starts, and also where I think you do a good job of gently calling Christians to task for not always being the most hospitable at those
Yeah.
tables.
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear you talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I use the table as kind of the illustration of the place where the common good is cultivated. And that language of cultivation is specific too, which is to say that so often it's presumed that like the common good is something we find by studying books or, you know, reading the right things or watching documentaries or seeing examples of how other people have brought about the common good. And cultivation points to something that is built, not found. That the common good can only arise, can only be built in community with people across lines of difference. Otherwise, we don't have a truly common good. We just have uh, what I problematize in the book, which is these appeals to the common good. And part of the inspiration and the desire to write the book was that I had heard this language so often. I mean, especially growing up, both in, a Polish Catholic neighborhood and especially in this white evangelical megachurch, visions of the common good that were claimed to be universal but didn't include me. And so what do I do with that? And then, as we moved into the beginning and our current political moment, and this rhetoric of the common good continues to come up, and it's these kind of universalizing terms that assume everyone is on the same page, but really it's just speak for an in-group to say, wink wink, this is about us. And
Yeah.
I want to problematize that significantly and say, no, if you want to talk about the common good, and you can't go across the street and find something good that you and your neighbor share, why are you saying that there is the common good for our entire world, for all of society, for all of human history? And so I want to get local with visions of the common good and say, from there, yes, like let's expand and think about a common good, not only for our neighborhood, but for our city, for our state, for our region. Perhaps there is a common good for our country, for the world. The focus of the book isn't to propose those things, it's to say, let's begin the work of figuring that out in our neighborhoods. And to do that requires coming to this table. And I say that, one, this table already exists. You don't have to build it. People are there. It's at community centers. It's at neighborhood potlucks. It's on city councils. People are gathering across lines of difference, but Christians don't join them because they presume they can do it all themselves. Or I talk about in the book, they do show up, they walk past their seat at the table, grab the microphone, and assume, oh, we're running the meeting because we're the Christians. And the invitation of the book is to say, take a seat, join with people across lines of difference, listen charitably, understand the joys, the fears, the vulnerabilities, the wisdom that other traditions hold and other people who think very differently from you hold. To do this, though, I talk about kind of in this Augustinian frame, the role of desire, that the table also doesn't work if we show up, sit in the corner, cover our ears, and start, shouting because we don't want to listen to anyone else. We have to desire to love our neighbors, to see our neighbors not as something to use towards some greater thing, but to enjoy, to appreciate, to love our neighbors in and of themselves because they're our neighbors. And, from the Christian tradition, they are made in the image of God. They are worthy of love, dignity, respect, care, because God has deemed that to be so. And so often, I think Christians treat their neighbors like a utility, in a very utilitarian way, that there's something to use on the path to, ultimately loving God or seeking some good for themselves, or, especially for evangelicals, it's just conversion. It's like, oh, let me, I say this as someone through the tradition that it's almost like this feigned love of like, oh, I'm thinking and I want to hear your story, but really I'm trying to find touch points so that I can, find where the gospel fits in your life, and that I can share it with you in a way that's meaningful to you.
Right.
Uh,
That
and
come as you are, but don't leave as you came
mhm,
type thing.
exactly. Uh, and so the table is trying to offer the space of saying, yes, Christian, you are invited to come in the fullness of your tradition. So is your neighbor. So is your Muslim neighbor. So is your Jewish neighbor. So is your Hindu, Buddhist, agnostic, whatever else neighbor. Uh, this table is not one where we debate and try to figure out who is right theologically, religiously, spiritually. Instead, it's to say, we each have deep wells of wisdom, of belief, of values and virtues that we bring to our neighborhood. Let's lay out the best of our traditions, and seek a common good together. Seek the shared flourishing of our neighborhood, to tie my flourishing as a Christian to my neighbor's flourishing, who fundamentally does not like Christianity, perhaps has been hurt, traumatized, frustrated by, um, antagonized by Christianity and Christians. Um,
hmm
this is the work of the table and cultivating a truly common good that's not uh, the common good as what's good for the most amount of people. I think that's tyranny, to simply go by a majority rules type of common good, but instead to say even those at the margins have a seat at the table, have an equal voice uh, at the table to share what is good for them, and
hmm
what shared flourishing can look like.
Mm-hmm. And one of the ways you move on from the table to neighborhoods, which, as I mentioned, when after 2024, the election and everything, like that was very discouraging for a wide swath of the American population, because of what that represented, and just the the existing deep divisions that it just seemed had sort of re-entrenched themselves in that sort of post-election moment, and all of the many moments in the almost year and a half since that. One of the things, and this is going to be a longer preamble, but it's relevant. One of the things that my wife and I realized was that we didn't really know our neighbors. We live in the suburbs. So we live on like on a small street, and we didn't really know our neighbors. So we started. My wife had an incredible idea to just, have Friday drinks on our street and see who would come out. And over the course of months, we got to know people, and that was really, really powerful. But and that was something that was very encouraging for us when we needed some encouragement. Um, but at the same time, American culture is absolutely atomized. Um, I didn't really know my neighbors until last year. Um, and then compounding on that, like we live in what Rene DeResta calls bespoke realities, because of just the nature of our various media ecosystems, and the fact that now it's tailored specifically to the TV/phone that we carry in our pocket all the time.
Mhm.
So with all of that in mind, just this atomization, and um, and I know that even that is not necessarily a universal experience. Um, is there any other particular way that beyond just the table, that you think that Christians, including evangelicals or people who were raised in evangelicalism, and no longer are, like any particular way that you see for as entry points, starting points for them to engage in their neighborhoods in a good faith manner?
Yeah, I mean, my suggestion is always to find ways to serve others in a practice of decentering yourself.
hmm
This is the same reply I have when folks say, like, well, how do you find hope in this moment? How do you, offer a hopeful vision in this time of what is rightfully a deep frustration, deep despair, unknowing, um, unknowing without a resolution in sight. We can get into if a resolution is what we should be seeking.
Sure,
Uh,
sure, yeah.
but I always say go, find a food pantry, find a local hospital and serve, not to center yourself, not to be, again, the Christian who's like, oh, let me give you this ladle of soup. And also, have you heard of Jesus? But instead, uh, in the most polite way, close your mouth unless you're asking a question and talk to the people around you. Talk to the people who find themselves in line at a soup kitchen or food pantry. And instead of making assumptions about them, hear their stories and what their concerns are for their community, how the struggles of our world, both at a communal and national and global level, have affected them. And also hear about the things that they hope for and the things that bring them joy. Um, be a smiling face, folks. It's now more than ever just the most daunting and treacherous thing to have to go to the hospital for something. Um, one of my mom volunteers just to bring people to like their waiting room from the main lobby. It's like, this is for me, and I disagree with my parents significantly on a lot of things, politically, socially, culturally, and yet I'm like, wow, that's a good practice of neighbor love. Like simply being someone who's there to help folks, to be a smiling face when, I mean, if you're going to the doctor, if you're going to an emergency room, like something is wrong, there's anxiety, there's fear. Uh, I think those are deep practices of neighbor love, of caring for others in a way that doesn't, I think as Christians, there's a temptation to say like, yeah, I want to love my neighbors, but I want to do it in a way that like I'm recognized for it. Like I want people to know that I'm loving my neighbors. Uh,
Hmm.
and I think the turn here is to say, no, uh, let, let God see your works, and leave it at that, and serve people because they are worthy of being served. They're worthy of uh, being loved and cared for. Sometimes in periods of isolation when no one else will care for them. And so I think those are deep practices of neighbor love. I get into a few others in the book that you'd imagine, like compassion, and lamentation. I also try to provide some new language for other practices that we've done for, or Christians have done for long periods of time. And I draw from Paul Farmer to talk about accompaniment, this path of journeying with people for the long haul and not just a short period of time. Hartmut Rosa, who's a sociologist, has this practice or idea of resonance, that's really philosophically and intellectually rich. Um,
Hmm.
but in its most basic form is like, and as someone who's musically inclined, love this illustration of joining in tune, coming into tune with the people around you, like an orchestra, tuning together before a symphony. Uh, and this practice of, again, not just speaking, not just producing, but listening intently and listening in such a way that you are responding by joining in tune and resonance with the people around you. And so I mentioned these, as practices where I'm trying to, in the book, I'm trying to walk the line of saying there are tangible things to do. And also, because I'm talking about a particular local common good, I'm not going to prescribe how you should love your neighbors because you have your own neighbors who are different from mine and who need to be loved in their own ways. It is your task to figure that out. For your neighborhood, folks need to be loved and enjoy being loved through over drinks. I think that's incredible. I think, being in Wisconsin, that there's probably some resonance there too. I could do something similar. Uh, in other spaces, maybe that's not the case. Maybe it's something else. Uh,
Hmm.
and so the balance of the book is always trying to say there are tangible practices that we can implement to do this, and also bring them to your community and make them work in a way that is meaningful for the people around you, and not just taking, some bullet point that I've put in a book and saying, oh, this is exactly how we do it.
Prophet, priest, and king. That's where,
Hmm.
yeah, and the various roles, the various roles there. I really thought it was interesting that you sort of um, that you equated prophets with people who use deconstructive sort of
Mm.
language. And I do know that since you're in academia, I know that has a very particular meaning within various parts of academia. However, the way it's used in sort of popular culture or online discourse is really just reckoning with your inherited belief system, right? and your and how the process of determining whether you want to, selectively discard certain things or walk away entirely. You write that today this deconstructive work often looks like Christians who are methodically dismantling their faith brick by brick, testing the integrity and purpose of each part of the whole. Do you think that today's practicing Christians can also learn from those who either leave the faith, but still have sort of prophetic things to say to the people that are still within the flock, or do you think that for some people may be out of bounds or not not how they would understand something like a notion of being prophetic or prophecy, so to speak?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, in my theological imagination, we better be listening to people who leave the faith, who are who deconstruct and come to a point where they say, this isn't viable. This isn't my home. This doesn't resonate with me. I can't accept these claims as being truthful. And however we want to take truthful to signify or to mean. I think if the church is not listening to these folks, then they're missing something incredibly valuable and important. If the work of prophecy, yes, is proclaiming God's vision and God's desires to the world, without trying to baptize the world in a theological or Christian schema. I think people outside the tradition do that all the time to Christians.
Yeah.
And I don't mean that in like a flippant, like God can use anyone, and but truly that sometimes it needs to be harsh, critical voices outside the church to say, like, I mean, could you give me permission? Get your shit together.
Yeah.
Why are you doing this? Like, it's a slap in the face to, like, wake up. And I think people do that inside the church, and there's constraints to that, and there's complicity in that. This is I think a part of being a part of any institution, any tradition, is you balance this complicity with action and reform from within. And I mean, that was me with American evangelicalism, of saying, do I want to be a true evangelical and say I'm doing something different from within the tradition and being a part of these groups and institutions, or am I someone who leaves the evangelical tradition and says, I understand what you're doing, I get the schema, I get why you're coming to the conclusions that you are, and I think you're wrong. I think there's people who do that, who leave the tradition entirely, who again say, I get why you think that, I once thought that, I think that's completely wrong, or you need to think about this in a different way, or here's another way of looking at this. And I think there's almost the benefit of people who leave the tradition is that it's not an evangelism to say, come leave as well, which is often the presumption, but instead saying, if you're going to stay, you should know about these things, and you should have an answer for why, corruption, injustice, wrongdoing, offense, hurt, everything in between and beyond that is taking place. And if you can't reconcile that to your faith, then maybe you should also consider what this means for you. But that's a long-winded way of saying Christians better be listening to people outside the tradition, whether they were once in the tradition and leave or were never in the tradition at all. The failure of Christianity is assuming that all the answers exist within the walls of the church, or in a very evangelical way, within the pages of the Christian scriptures, which is what who was it? Mike Johnson, who goes, people want to know what Mike Johnson thinks about this topic, and I say, open your Bible. Like, what does the Bible have to say about the American, the budget, the federal government, specific legislative policies? I get what I say as an evangelical, I get what he's doing. I think it's manipulative and wrong and unthoughtful, or too thoughtful in a really sadistic and terrible way. But yeah, I think folks, this is part of the table, I think, as well as traditions being able to hear what other people think and have to say about different traditions in the space of hopefully shared cooperation and mutual charity and understanding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I appreciate that. I appreciate that thoughtful answer. I do think that you touched on a couple of things that I think that speak to the nuance that you bring to this, and also strangely the like difficulty of speaking to things with nuance across various potential audiences, and just in general in the sort of moment that we're in, so to speak. Um, I think another thing that is illustrative of this might be a recent Christianity Today write-up of your book, and because I think that it's sort of representative of some of these limitations of, in particular, like evangelical acceptability. And the reason why I keep coming back to this is because I think that your book is inclusive of them as a potential audience, but also it reckons with various criticisms in very, again, very magnanimous ways. So I'm going to speak to it. That you don't have to speak to it directly. You can speak to it sort of more generally if you want. But within that write-up, it took some issue with your use of various pronouns for God, as well as your supposed lack of specificity, that you weren't like citing specific examples of things in a book that is not really written in that regard. It's written to be broad. It's written to be general. So to me, those things highlight some of the difficulty of running into what is acceptable within that particular framework. And again, I think I'm reading you right in that you want to include those types of people in this broader process and this broader vision of good visions for communities, for local places. But those tensions still exist. So I'm just curious how you're navigating engaging with those objections or those points and just even your book's very recently out. So I'm sure this is all fairly fresh, but I'm curious how you're feeling about that.
Yeah, I mean, it was a really interesting review. I think, at one point they call me Peterson instead of Peterman, and I was like, I think that's kind of indicative of how closely the book was read, whether it was a typo or not. But the book, as you mentioned, is meant to be general. The initial manuscript of this book was much more specific, and it was almost 3 times as long.
Oh,
And
wow.
working with my editor, we got at the heart of, one, the fact that I was writing like a seminary, and I began writing this book a year after seminary, and then wrote for a while, but initially was including a lot more theological kind of jargon and argumentation and references to different folks, and a lot of that got cut out, and a lot of the specificity. One, because I mean, as you know, like, you write a book and then it sits and it goes through marketing and waiting until publication, and like, what anecdotes, what examples, as someone who mostly writes op-eds, what things are going to stick in a year and a half from now, that people will look back to and go, oh yes, this. And it's hard to tell sometimes in the moment when things are happening. It seems, especially in the world today, like everything is something that's going to stick. And yet then we look a year back and it's not everything that sticks, let alone more than a year, 2, 3, 5 years. I think, for me, it goes back to this notion of desire, to come to the table with a disposition of charity and humility and understanding. And for the evangelical as well, the invitation is to join us at the table, but not to, again, not to plug your ears or to go, oh, someone, used feminine pronouns for God, like, can't listen to them, cannot, I'm not going to engage, which I think is what the review failed to do, was engage with the actual argument of the book, and instead focus on the fact that I call God, or refer to God as God's self, which at the year of our Lord, 2026, should not, in my opinion, should not be a stumbling block for someone to get to the argument that a person is making, whether
Yeah,
in
yeah,
any
yeah.
context. I don't think it
Right.
should like stop people from comprehending a sentence.
Hmm.
Disagree with it, sure, but to not engage with the substance of something because of something I think is deeply politicized, pronouns, when there is no, I mean, in my, again, my theological schema take is that there's no there's no reason to not use God's self. I, to a degree, think
Sure.
there's no reason to not refer to God with feminine pronouns. Um, sure, there's an acceptability to using masculine pronouns, a familiarity, perhaps, a common acceptance, uh, but the invitation of the table is to say yes, show up, but don't close yourself off. Don't stop listening because someone says something you disagree with or says
Hmm.
something in language that you don't accept. Now you're not at the table. Now you are plugging your ears. Now you are just there to share your position, and not listen to anyone else. And so, yeah, in a short response to it, said, like, the invitation for the shared flourishing includes them. I do believe that my flourishing is bound up with the flourishing of my evangelical neighbors. Uh, and also, my desire is not that they run away to their corners or to that Christianity today becomes this like hyper exclusive space that only a very specific brand of evangelical or Christian is reading, but instead that they see the beauty that exists beyond those walls, even within the Christian church. I mean, I think they ripped it. Both know Jared Stacy. They ripped his book apart, and then a couple weeks later, my review of the book came out in the Christian Century. I'm like, wow, this is needed. Um, and two very different takes on a
Hmm.
book that's trying to call out and I think is deeply invitational in trying to bring evangelicals into this broader understanding of society and the world and the way that religion and belief works. Um, and that's always the invitation is to come and join the work that's being done across lines of different small and large. And but I think the review is indicative of a position that's unwilling to do that.
Hmm. Great response. Thank you for going into that. I actually have what I've been doing with a handful of authors is just doing to lighten things up at the end of it and to wrap things up at the end of a conversation, just like a lightning round
Mm.
of sort of book related questions. So um, I uh, I'm just there's just 5 questions. And I'm just curious about your experience as a first time author and everything. And it's always fun to run through these. So we've got a few more minutes left in our time. Let's just run through these quickly, and then we'll plug the book and do everything else to wrap up our time. But the first question for you is: as a reader, do you have a preference between print, ebooks, audiobooks, or are you an omnivore and do all the above?
Ooh, uh, always print for me if I can. I love having like a book. It's for me it's deeply inefficient because I do digital notes.
Hmm.
And so it'd be so much easier to just pick up books on, ebooks, uh, and copy paste things. But instead, I love the materiality of sitting with a book in my hands. Uh, both behind both of us, we have bookshelves.
Yeah, yeah.
And gosh, I love just like being like, surrounded by books. Like there's something
Hmm.
that sparks my imagination and my creativity to write, uh, versus having books. And I also love like when people come over and they like scan my bookshelves. Like that for me
Yeah,
is an identity marker, saying
sure.
like these are the people I'm in conversation with. These are the things I'm reading. So uh, yeah, I love the way that print books make me inefficient and to sit down with something in my hands and carry it with me, uh, and all the things that would be alleviated by a Kindle or whatever else.
Yeah,
So yeah, print for me.
nice. What is a book in your field that you think deserves more attention?
Oh
You can do multiple
yeah,
if you do. Like,
there's an older book by a I believe is a Peruvian theologian turned poet named Hubeim Alves, uh, who has a book called "I Believe in the Resurrection of the Body" that you think is like this theological treatise about like if you know reason for the resurrection, and instead it's this beautiful incarnational devotion of considering what it would mean that God desires a body, so
Mm,
much so that God would incarnate God's self to the form of creation, um, and dwell with God's people. It's just this beautiful, beautiful meditation that I don't think many folks know about. It's kind of out of print, but there's like copies floating around. Uh, and it's an incredible book. It's from a couple decades ago, but it's just like a book you can read through in half a day, but you can also sit with it for months and months and just tinker with it and meditate on it. I suppose that's one book that I think needs a bit more appreciation.
awesome. What is a book that either gives you the most hope or makes you feel the most alive right now? Whichever direction you want to take that.
Oh, I am deep in the weeds of Martin Heidegger, um, who is a deeply problematic philosopher, uh,
Hmm.
and also someone who is reckoning with the idea of death. Um, and what does it mean? The question of what it means to be. And Heidegger is not, in his own writing, hopeful. He's basically says we live towards our death. We anticipate our death in such a way that we live in light of it. Um, and he's also deeply like anti-Christian. He has this essay called Nietzsche's Word, God is Dead, where he's critiquing indirectly Boltzmann, who is a former colleague of his. Um, and yet Heidegger's this futural vision of being in the world and being tossed uh, tossed around within it, and it's just this deeply embodied, visceral philosophy that has made me think so much more about what it means to be, what it means for God to be, or for God not to be. Um, I'll leave it at that. But that's a book that has just been exciting me. That essay, and then broadly, Being in Time, is kind of his primary work.
Hmm.
That has just like given me a lot of energy to think about these things.
Interesting. I haven't thought of him in a long time. My college roommate he was a philosophy major. He wrote his thesis on Heidegger.
Mm.
Um, Next question. Turning towards advice to either writers or academics who are just getting started, what is something that you wish you knew earlier?
I wish I knew how hard writing was. Like there's the early stages where I think I like had so much inspiration, and I was like constantly like at my computer and had this new idea, and then started to build connections and was writing op-eds, and people were publishing it, and then you get to a point where it's like, oh, I'm tired. But I gotta.
Yeah.
I've now like this is part of my living. I gotta keep going. And I think I wish I would have known early on that I was setting myself up for a hard career path. That writing isn't just this very glamorous, like sitting at my desk with a cigarette and a and
Yeah.
a beer and or scotch and
Yeah.
pondering the questions of life. It's like no, it's like getting so angry at my keyboard because I'm hitting the wrong key and the words aren't coming to me,
Yeah.
and needing to like take a break. I wish I would have known that earlier. I love all of it, and the satisfaction that comes when you get on the other side of that frustration. But nobody told me how hard it was to be a writer.
Mm-hmm. And final question, as far as like if you had a magic wand and you were going to take one particular action to just encourage either more reading or literacy in today's sort of media climate, what is like, sort of big sci-fi question, or like, if we're going to just have some sort of effect on culture at large, what do you think that would be like that would encourage more reading or the notion of literacy?
Mm. Oh, the first thing that comes to mind is that if I could wave a magic wand, there would be a library on every corner.
Amazing. I love that answer.
Not only for
Yeah.
books, but for like the resources that a library gives to a community.
Yeah, absolutely.
If people could access books that readily, which we can to a degree, but if our biggest problem was that, oh, there's too many libraries, that'd be a great problem to have.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. The book is called Becoming Neighbors: The Common Good Made Local. Is there anything else you'd like to mention here at the end?
Only that I'd
Other
love
places
for
to find you?
Yeah, I would love for folks. I'm still on Substack. I'm also on Instagram and Threads, and like you, I'm trying my hand at TikTok. I feel old every time I open that app. Um,
I'm
I'm
older
like,
than you, so just imagine.
but I'm trying. Your video essays are wonderful. I'm trying my hand at finding some sort of niche audience there. And so if you like the video style essay, you can follow me there. Otherwise, I do a lot more writing on the Instagram thread space, and then especially on Substack.
Nice. We'll make sure that all those are in the show notes. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Hey everybody, thanks so much for watching and listening to this. If you are watching this over on YouTube, do the YouTube thing and like and subscribe so that you can be notified whenever I post. If you're listening to this throughout podcast land, check the show notes for how you can support the show over at blakechastain.com. That's it for now. Good luck out there.
Breaking news for your home. Wayday. Wayfair's big sale is almost here, and you can score the best deals in home. Like up to 80% off everything home. Yes, you heard that right. 80% off with free shipping on everything. Plus surprise flash deals all Wayday long. We're talking outdoor furniture and essentials, rugs, and more. All at Wayfair, and all up to 80% off during Wayday. Shop Wayfair's Wayday from April 25th through 27th.
Wayfair, every style, every home.